In October 1847, the city of Richmond, Virginia was rocked by a scandal that exposed the rotten underbelly of Southern aristocracy. Victoria Langford, a pillar of high society and heiress to a vast fortune, was discovered lifeless in her lavish estate, seemingly felled by a heart attack at just 31 years old. But as whispers turned to investigations, what emerged was a nightmare of power, lust, and unimaginable cruelty that had thrived in the shadows for years. Buckle up, because this true story will make you question how many monsters hide behind masks of respectability. The Langford mansion rose majestically 4 miles from the city center, strategically isolated by acres of land and surrounded by a dense row of oak trees that completely blocked the view from any nearby road. With its white columns and meticulously maintained gardens, the property was a symbol of Southern success and tradition. Victoria Langford had inherited not only the house, but also a considerable fortune, and more than 22 slaves when her first husband died in 1841, leaving her widowed at 25. Her second marriage to Edward Langford in 1842 had been viewed by local society as a perfect union. Edward, a prosperous 47-year-old merchant, brought stability and valuable commercial connections. Victoria, in turn, offered social status and a substantial inheritance. To outside observers, they formed an exemplary couple of the Virginian elite. During the day, Victoria personally supervised domestic work, organized dinners for local high society, and actively participated in Methodist church activities. Her acquaintances described her as a determined woman, though some commented on her occasionally explosive temper with employees. What drew attention, however, was the extraordinary turnover of slaves on the Langford property. While most families kept the same workers for years, Victoria bought and sold slaves with a frequency that intrigued and even bothered local traders. They had come to comment among themselves that she seemed to have very specific criteria in her acquisitions, always preferring young and attractive men and women. During her second marriage, commercial records would later show that Victoria had purchased 68 different slaves for a property that never maintained more than 28 workers simultaneously. These numbers were not just unusual. They were completely outside normal patterns, even for a prosperous farm. Nathaniel, a slave of approximately 27 years who had arrived at the property in 1844, quickly became a central figure in the hierarchy that Victoria meticulously controlled. Tall, muscular, and intelligent, he had gained his mistress's trust through his efficiency and absolute discretion. Nathaniel supervised other slaves, reported infractions, and had access to areas of the house normally forbidden to workers. What occasional visitors didn't know was that the Langford property operated very differently after nightfall. Lights remained on in the main house until late hours, and there was mysterious activity that unfolded away from curious eyes. The property's location ensured that these nocturnal activities remained completely private. The house's domestic employees, 2 elderly women who handled cooking and cleaning, occasionally commented among themselves about their mistress's strange habits. They noticed that Victoria frequently summoned specific slaves to the main house during the night, claiming need for special work or meetings about the next day's tasks. These summons always involved the youngest and most attractive slaves. The relationship between Victoria and Edward also intrigued those who knew them well. They maintained separate bedrooms, a practice not entirely uncommon among the elite, but were rarely seen showing affection in public. Edward seemed constantly tense, always deferring to his wife's opinions and decisions, as if he were perpetually walking on eggshells. In 1846, the frequency of slave transactions on the Langford property increased dramatically. Victoria began buying and selling workers almost monthly, always with the same specific criteria of age and physical appearance. Some local traders began asking more direct questions about her motivations, but she always offered vague explanations about specialized needs and resource optimization. During this period, some slaves who had worked on the Langford property and were later sold to other families in the region began displaying deeply disturbing behaviors. Some became completely withdrawn and melancholic. Others developed severe sleep problems and frequent nightmares. When questioned about their experiences at the Langford house, they invariably refused to speak or showed visible signs of terror. Victoria herself began showing signs of dramatic change during 1847. Always a robust woman, she gained considerable weight and developed increasingly reclusive habits during the day. She canceled several important social commitments and began receiving visitors only on very specific occasions. Her domestic employees noticed that she slept during the day and stayed awake most of the night. Even more disturbing, Victoria had developed the habit of conducting personal inspections of newly arrived slaves that went far beyond practical needs. She examined them in detail, making notes in a small notebook she always carried, and made decisions about their assignments based on criteria that no one could completely understand. Edward, in turn, began spending more time away from home, claiming commercial commitments in neighboring cities. When present, he seemed increasingly tense and avoided eye contact with his wife. Some observers noted that he had begun drinking much more than usual during social events, and his hands trembled visibly when he thought no one was watching. In September, just 1 month before her death, Victoria made a significant slave purchase, acquiring 5 young workers at once, 3 men and 2 women, all between 19 and 23 years old. The trader who conducted the transaction would later report that she seemed particularly demanding, examining each slave with an intensity that left him deeply uncomfortable. Victoria Langford's last week of life was marked by intense activity on the property. Traders making occasional deliveries reported lights burning all night in the main house and constant movement between buildings. Nathaniel and other slaves seemed especially nervous, avoiding eye contact with visitors and whispering among themselves when they thought they weren't being observed. The domestic employees noticed that Victoria had become even more demanding and irritable during her final days. She shouted frequently, made contradictory demands, and seemed constantly worried about something she refused to discuss. They also observed that she had begun locking her room during the day, something she had never done before. On the morning of October 17th, Edward Langford found his wife dead in her bed. She was lying in an apparently natural position, with no visible signs of violence or struggle. The local doctor, Dr. Theodore Caldwell, was called immediately and declared the cause of death as sudden heart attack, a conclusion that seemed reasonable considering Victoria's weight and apparent lack of regular physical exercise. Victoria Langford's funeral was one of the largest social events in the city that year. Hundreds of people attended to pay their final respects. The Methodist Church Reverend praised her generosity and Christian dedication, while friends and acquaintances shared memories of her hospitality and elegance. But even during the funeral, some attentive observers noticed strange behaviors. The slaves from the Langford property seemed more relieved than mourning. Nathaniel, in particular, was seen whispering intensely with other workers, and some seemed to be making plans or important decisions about something clearly unrelated to grief. Edward Langford, though visibly shaken by the loss, also showed signs of something beyond normal grief. He seemed anxious, constantly looking around as if expecting some kind of revelation or confrontation. During the ceremony, his hands trembled visibly, and he had difficulty pronouncing the words of thanks to those present. In the days following the funeral, the Langford property's routine changed drastically. Edward dismissed the domestic employees and began selling slaves with an urgency that surprised even local traders. Nathaniel and other key workers were sold to properties in distant counties, a decision that surprised those who knew the value of these experienced slaves. The initial investigation into Victoria's death had been superficial, as was common at the time for apparently natural deaths of respectable people. But small details began to bother Victoria's brothers, who were concerned about inheritance and suspicious of Edward's inexplicable haste in liquidating all family assets. It was then that the first suspicions about possible poisoning arose. Victoria's brothers, concerned about inheritance issues and genuinely suspicious of Edward's increasingly strange behavior, decided to hire a private investigator. They wanted answers about the circumstances of their sister's death and about what exactly was happening on the property she had controlled with such secrecy. Benjamin Hargrove, an experienced investigator from Alexandria with a reputation for discovering truths that others preferred to keep buried, was hired to examine more closely the events surrounding Victoria Langford's death. What he would discover would exceed the family's worst suspicions and reveal secrets that threatened to shake the very foundations of respectable local society. Benjamin Hargrove arrived in town in February 1848, hired by Victoria Langford's brothers, who suspected something deeply wrong had happened to their sister. An experienced investigator with more than 15 years of career, Hargrove had developed a reputation for discovering truths that other professionals frequently ignored, but he knew that investigations in small, closed communities required extreme discretion and infinite patience. Hargrove's first impression of the Langford case was that he was dealing with something much more complex than a simple suspicious death. His experience had taught him that when wealthy families died suddenly and surviving spouses acted strangely, there were usually financial or personal secrets that someone had a desperate interest in keeping hidden. Dr. Theodore Caldwell, the physician who had declared the cause of death, was the first person Hargrove sought out. But the conversation was frustrating from the beginning. Caldwell was a respected professional, but his explanation about the heart attack seemed based more on convenient assumptions than concrete medical evidence. When pressed for specific details, Caldwell admitted he had not performed a detailed post-mortem examination, considering it unnecessary given the family's social status. What intrigued Hargrove was Caldwell's description of the body's position. Victoria had been found lying on her back, with her arms at her sides, and an apparently serene expression. For someone who had suffered a heart attack, this position was highly unusual. Heart attack victims are frequently found in positions suggesting struggle, extreme discomfort, or at least attempts to seek help. Hargrove then focused on examining the Langford property, but encountered immediate and systematic resistance. Edward had allowed only extremely limited access, claiming he was organizing his wife's belongings and preparing the house for urgent sale. During his restricted and supervised inspection, Hargrove managed to notice only some details that seemed inconsistent with the narrative of a conventional family. Victoria's room was luxuriously decorated, but there were subtle signs of wear, suggesting very intensive use. The bed's mattress showed irregular pressure marks. There were small objects in drawers that made no sense in the context of a respectable lady. Thin ropes, small bottles with oily substances, and pieces of intimate clothing that didn't seem to belong to Victoria. The slave area at the back of the property also presented some anomalies that caught Hargrove's attention. The quarters were in better condition than normal for worker accommodations, but there was evidence of recent modifications that made no practical sense. Some doors had additional locks installed on the inside, several windows had been partially covered with boards, and there were small marks carved into the walls that seemed to form some kind of communication system between occupants. Edward Langford showed signs of growing extreme nervousness as the investigation progressed. He completely avoided answering direct questions about his wife's nighttime routine, especially about her activities after nightfall. When questioned about the extraordinary slave turnover, Edward offered vague and contradictory explanations about specialized commercial needs that made no economic sense. Hargrove decided to examine the Langford family's available commercial records, but quickly discovered that many crucial documents were being reorganized due to preparation for the property's sale. What he managed to access with great difficulty showed buying and selling patterns that were statistically impossible to explain through normal agricultural needs. The demographic profile of purchases revealed absolute preference for young, physically attractive workers. All were described in sale records as physically adequate and well-formed, criteria that, while relevant for agricultural work, were applied with a consistency suggesting selection based on specific physical characteristics. The records also showed that many slaves were sold after extremely short periods. Some remained on the property for only a few weeks or months. Others were sold and occasionally repurchased, creating a circulation pattern that could be explained by commercial needs, but seemed unusually frequent and costly for any legitimate agricultural operation. During his limited analysis of financial records he managed to access, Hargrove discovered some transactions that were difficult to explain through conventional commercial activities. There were occasional payments to local individuals described only as special services or private consultations, though the amounts weren't extraordinary. These payments suggested the Langfords were involved in activities beyond their declared commercial operations. Hargrove also noticed that Edward had begun liquidating assets with a speed bordering on panic after his wife's death. Besides selling slaves, he was disposing of valuable furniture, jewelry, and even preparing the property for sale at a value well below market. This decision to leave the region could be explained by grief, but the desperate urgency suggested other, more pressing motivations. The local community began noticing Hargrove's persistent presence and his increasingly specific questions about the Langford family. Some high society members expressed growing discomfort with what they saw as an unnecessarily intrusive investigation of a respectable family. The Methodist Church reverend even commented publicly that it would be more appropriate to let the dead rest in peace and not disturb the memory of a pious lady. However, Hargrove had learned throughout his career that organized community resistance frequently indicated there was something significant to be discovered. Truly innocent people rarely opposed legitimate investigations with such vehemence, especially when conducted discreetly and with respect for local sensibilities. It was during an apparently casual conversation with a local trader that Hargrove obtained his first truly significant clue. The trader mentioned he had sold unusual quantities of candles, lamp oil, and even small mirrors to the Langford property during recent years. The quantities were large enough that he had commented to other traders about Victoria lighting up the property, as if it were the city center during nights. Hargrove also discovered that the Langford family had made extensive and expensive modifications to the property during 1846. They had hired carpenters to install additional acoustic insulation in certain parts of the main house, build a covered and private passage connecting the house to the slave quarters, and even install a rudimentary heating system that kept certain areas of the house comfortable during the night, even in harsh winter. Hargrove's investigation faced growing difficulties when he tried to access Methodist church records. The Reverend categorically refused to allow him to examine the Langford family's donation and participation records, claiming absolute religious confidentiality. This resistance was unusual, as donation records were generally considered information that reflected positively on donors. During one of the few permitted visits to the Langford property, Hargrove managed to make a discovery that would completely change the direction of his investigation. Through careful observation and deduction, he noticed there was a discrepancy in the basic financial records that Edward had allowed him to examine, revenue entries that didn't correspond to the family's declared commercial activities. Through meticulous analysis of these limited records, Hargrove realized there was a pattern of small but regular revenues that couldn't be explained by agriculture or conventional commerce. These entries occurred frequently enough to represent a significant additional income source over time. Even more intriguing, these mysterious revenues seemed to correlate with periods of greatest slave turnover. When Victoria bought new slaves, the unexplained revenues increased. When she sold workers, revenues decreased. There was clearly a connection between slave management and some revenue-generating activity that wasn't being declared in official commercial records. Hargrove realized he had discovered evidence of activities that went far beyond normal plantation operations. The financial pattern suggested Victoria was using her slaves to generate revenue in ways that violated the social norms of the time, even within the already morally questionable context of slavery. Analysis of these limited financial records revealed that the mysterious activities had occurred regularly for several years. The entries were chronologically organized and showed a growth pattern over time, suggesting that whatever operation Victoria was conducting had expanded and become more profitable with experience. Even more concerning, there were some vague references in the records to special arrangements and personalized services. Though details were intentionally obscure, the annotations suggested Victoria had allowed other people to participate in her activities in exchange for payments or favors. With this limited but suggestive evidence in hand, Hargrove knew he needed to proceed with extreme caution. The potentially involved people had enough influence to make his investigation impossible if they discovered what he had found. At the same time, the nature of the discoveries required deeper investigation to protect his contractor's interests. Benjamin Hargrove spent 3 days meticulously analyzing the limited financial records he had managed to access, working in his hotel room to avoid observation. What he discovered through this careful analysis confirmed his suspicions that he was dealing with something much more serious than a simple, suspicious death. The financial patterns revealed a systematic operation that had functioned for more than 5 years. The records showed small but consistent revenue entries that didn't correspond to any known legitimate commercial activity. During peak periods, these mysterious revenues totaled modest but significant amounts for the time, especially considering they represented additional income beyond declared agricultural activities. What made these records particularly revealing was the direct correlation between unexplained revenues and slave turnover. Hargrove had carefully mapped the dates of slave purchases and sales against mysterious financial entries, and the pattern was unmistakable. When Victoria acquired new young and attractive slaves, revenues increased dramatically. When she sold workers, especially those who had been on the property for longer periods, revenues decreased proportionally. Even more disturbing, Hargrove discovered that Victoria had developed a basic categorization system in her financial records. There were simple codes corresponding to different revenue values. Slaves categorized as special generated the highest revenues, suggesting they were used for purposes Victoria considered more valuable. The analysis revealed that over the years, Victoria had documented activities involving dozens of different slaves. This meant extraordinary turnover, plus repeated activities with some individuals who remained on the property for longer periods. The records also showed evidence that Victoria's activities had expanded beyond personal impulses to include what she vaguely described as special arrangements. There were entries suggesting payments from external sources, indicating she had begun allowing other people to participate in her activities in exchange for financial compensation. During the most active periods, records showed frequent revenues, suggesting Victoria's activities had become an established routine, not occasional impulses, but a systematic behavior pattern that had integrated into the property's daily operation. Hargrove discovered that Nathaniel appeared in records much more frequently than other workers. There were entries suggesting he wasn't just a participant, but had assumed some kind of organizational role in Victoria's activities, possibly helping coordinate and supervise other slaves. Records showed significant expansion of operations to include external visitors. There were entries indicating payments from unidentified sources, suggesting she had begun charging external people for access to her slaves. These arrangements were sporadic but regular, occurring several times per month during peak periods, though records didn't contain specific names of external visitors. There were codes and vague references suggesting Victoria maintained a small but consistent client list. Entries showed some codes appeared repeatedly, indicating regular visitors who returned for similar arrangements over time. Financial analysis also revealed that Edward Langford wasn't ignorant of his wife's revenue-generating activities. There were entries showing his participation in the commercial aspect of the operation, including records of collected payments and expenses related to special activities. Edward was clearly aware and involved in the financial management of questionable activities. A particularly disturbing discovery was documentation of expenses related to pregnancies and births. Records showed payments to local midwives and costs associated with baby care, followed by revenue entries corresponding to selling these babies to families in distant counties. There was evidence of multiple births resulting from Victoria's activities. Victoria's final year record showed clear signs the situation was becoming problematic. Entries became more irregular. There were references to discipline problems and control costs, and revenues began declining even when the number of slaves on the property remained stable. Several entries from late that year showed unusual expenses related to security and preventive measures. There were payments to local individuals described only as special assistance, suggesting Victoria was spending money to resolve problems or maintain control over a deteriorating situation. Records also documented the deteriorating relationship between Victoria and Edward during her final months. There were entries suggesting discussions about operation reduction and risk elimination, but revenues continued, indicating Victoria refused to consider significant changes to her activities. A particularly ominous entry dated 2 weeks before Victoria's death showed a substantial expense described only as necessary solutions. The amount was larger than any previous expense related to special activities, suggesting she was planning extreme measures to resolve growing problems. Hargrove realized he had discovered not only evidence of immoral behavior, but also financial patterns suggesting motives for violence. If slaves had discovered Victoria was spending money on solutions for the problems they represented, they would have had reasons to fear for their lives. The investigator also noticed some records had been altered or removed. Apparently, recently, there were pages with crossed-out entries and some sections that seemed deliberately obscured, suggesting someone had tried to eliminate specific evidence after Victoria's death. Analysis of financial records revealed patterns explaining part of the Langford family's apparent prosperity. Special activity revenues were modest individually, but substantial cumulatively, significantly complementing gains from their legitimate commercial activities. Victoria had created an additional income source that depended completely on her ability to maintain secrecy and control. Hargrove began understanding that Victoria Langford's death hadn't just been the end of a life, but the collapse of a financial operation that had functioned for years and involved several people from the local community. The implications extended beyond an individual family, threatening to expose behavior that violated the social norms of the time. With these financial discoveries in hand, Hargrove faced a difficult decision. He had found evidence of activities requiring deeper investigation, but also knew that exposing the truth could have serious consequences for several people, including himself. Hargrove's search for additional evidence and witnesses quickly revealed he was dealing with something more dangerous and complex than he had initially imagined. His attempts to locate and interview former slaves from the Langford property encountered systematic difficulties, suggesting a coordinated campaign to disperse and silence anyone who could corroborate his financial discoveries. Of the slaves who had worked on the Langford property over the years, Hargrove managed to track down only 18 who were still alive and working on properties in the region. Of the others, official records showed many had died of diseases, fled and were never found, been sold to buyers in distant states, or had simply disappeared from records without adequate explanation. This disappearance and mortality rate was unusual, though not completely outside statistical patterns for a slave population over several years. However, the pattern suggested a deliberate effort had been made to disperse and separate those who had worked on the Langford property, especially those who had remained there for longer periods. Hargrove managed to locate and discreetly speak with only 2 former slaves from the Langford property, and both conversations were extremely difficult. The men showed extreme reluctance to talk about their experiences, offered evasive answers when gently pressed, and seemed genuinely terrified by the possibility that their conversations with the investigator might be discovered. Isaiah, one of the former slaves Hargrove managed to locate, finally agreed to provide some limited information after the investigator guaranteed his identity would be protected and he wouldn't be forced to testify publicly. What Isaiah revealed confirmed many patterns documented in financial records, but also revealed more disturbing aspects of the operation Victoria had directed. According to Isaiah, Victoria's operation functioned completely differently during the night. During the day, slaves performed normal agricultural work under conventional supervision. But after nightfall, some were regularly summoned to the main house for activities Isaiah vaguely described as special work that wasn't normal work. He refused to provide specific details, but confirmed these activities were regular and involved only the youngest slaves. Isaiah's limited testimony confirmed Nathaniel's role in the operation, but revealed his position was more complex than financial records suggested. He had become responsible for organizing nighttime activities and preparing new slaves to participate. Nathaniel used a combination of persuasion, special privileges, and subtle intimidation to ensure cooperation. Isaiah revealed that some female slaves were also involved in special activities, and several had become pregnant as a direct result. These women were kept under more controlled conditions and faced more severe consequences if they tried to resist or refuse participation. Isaiah confirmed that babies born from these situations were immediately removed and sold to distant families. Hargrove's investigation also revealed limited evidence that Victoria's visitor network was small, but consistent. Beyond patterns suggested by financial records, there was circumstantial evidence she provided access for some respectable men from the local community who occasionally visited the property during the night. These arrangements were extremely discreet and limited to people Victoria knew personally and trusted. When Hargrove tried to discreetly investigate local figures who might be involved, he encountered subtle but persistent resistance. William Hartwell, the prosperous merchant, completely refused to discuss the Langford family beyond superficial comments about their respectability. Samuel Morrison, the influential farmer, claimed no intimate knowledge of the family's activities and seemed genuinely uncomfortable with questions. James Patterson, a figure related to local law enforcement, showed signs of nervousness when questioned about the Langford family. As someone in a position of authority, Patterson had been positioned to protect or cover up questionable activities if necessary, and his defensive reaction suggested he had knowledge he preferred not to share. Hargrove discovered that Edward Langford had dramatically accelerated his plans to leave the region after learning of the ongoing investigation. He had quickly sold the property for a value substantially below market and was liquidating all remaining assets with an urgency bordering on panic. Local sources reported he seemed extremely nervous, had begun drinking heavily during the day, and was visibly losing weight due to stress. During a careful attempt to directly confront Edward about his discoveries, Hargrove was approached by two respectable community men who identified themselves as concerned friends of local reputation. They suggested, without making explicit threats, that it would be better for everyone involved if the investigation were discreetly ended, allowing the Langford family to be remembered with dignity and the community to move forward. This organized interference confirmed for Hargrove that he had discovered something local. Influential people had significant interest in keeping hidden. The presence of respectable intermediaries suggested there was an informal protection network extending beyond direct participants to include people concerned with social stability and community reputation. Hargrove's investigation also revealed circumstantial evidence that some officials and local authority figures had received contributions or gifts from the Langford family over the years. Though these contributions could be explained as normal civic generosity, their regularity and amounts suggested they served purposes beyond conventional charity. When Hargrove tried to access more detailed official records related to the Langford property, he discovered some crucial documents were unavailable due to file reorganization or had been accidentally damaged. This selective unavailability of records suggested a coordinated effort to limit access to potentially compromising information. Resistance to the investigation intensified when Hargrove tried to obtain official permission to examine the Langford property's remaining assets more thoroughly before their sale. Local authorities claimed there wasn't sufficient legal justification for a more invasive investigation, especially considering the family's respectable status and the apparently natural nature of the death. Hargrove realized he was facing not just individuals with personal secrets, but a local system that had adapted to protect certain activities and maintain social stability. The protection network included commercial figures, possibly officials, and respectable community members who had an interest in avoiding scandals that could harm the city's collective reputation. During this period, Hargrove noticed he was being discreetly observed by people he couldn't identify. His prolonged presence in the region had become known, and local individuals seemed to be monitoring his activities and conversations. His attempts to interview other community people were frustrated when potential witnesses refused to speak or claim no relevant knowledge about the Langford family. Despite growing difficulties, Hargrove managed to make an additional discovery through careful observation and deduction. During one of his limited visits to the property, he noticed physical evidence confirming his suspicions about nighttime activities, unusual wear in certain areas of the house, structural modifications that made no sense for normal domestic use, and signs of regular traffic between the main house and slave quarters. The most significant discovery was evidence that Victoria had used information about visitors' activities to obtain favors and protection, going far beyond direct financial payments. There were signs she had received assistance from local figures in commercial matters, protection against previous investigations, and even help acquiring specific slaves through unconventional channels. Discovery of this additional evidence confirmed for Hargrove that Victoria Langford's death had been more than just the end of a life. It had been the collapse of an operation involving several respectable people from the local community. Those involved weren't just protecting personal reputations, they were protecting themselves from possible public exposure and devastating social consequences. With this new, limited but significant evidence, Hargrove realized he had enough information to suggest the existence of a local network of questionable behavior, but also understood that completely exposing the truth would be extremely dangerous. Those involved had demonstrated a willingness to use organized social pressure and possibly other forms of intimidation to protect their secrets. Hargrove's decision on how to proceed was complicated by what he began to suspect about the exact circumstances of Victoria Langford's death. The evidence he had collected suggested patterns that could explain her death in ways going beyond natural causes. but he had no access to direct witnesses or conclusive physical evidence. During a final and extremely cautious conversation with Isaiah, the former slave provided vague but suggestive information about Victoria Langford's final days. Isaiah confirmed the situation on the property had become very tense during the weeks before her death, with growing conflicts between Victoria and some slaves about nighttime activities and working conditions. Isaiah also suggested, without providing specific details, that Nathaniel and other slaves had discovered Victoria was planning drastic changes that could affect their lives permanently. He refused to elaborate on the nature of these changes, but his expression and body language suggested the slaves had had reasons to fear for their safety. Hargrove's investigation reached its final point when he realized he would never gain access to direct evidence or witnesses who could confirm his most serious theories about what had really happened on the Langford property. With Isaiah dead in an accident just 2 days after their last conversation, and other former slaves dispersed or silenced, he was forced to base his conclusions on patterns, deductions, and circumstantial evidence that painted a disturbing, but not completely verifiable picture. Based on his analysis of financial records, limited testimonies, and physical evidence, Hargrove developed a theory about Victoria Langford's final months that explained both her death and the local community's extreme reaction. According to his analysis, the situation on the Langford property had become unsustainable during that fall, when Victoria's activities had escalated to levels threatening the entire operation's stability. Hargrove's theory suggested Victoria had become increasingly demanding and paranoid during her final months, increasing both the frequency of her demands and the severity of punishments for any form of resistance. Financial records showed growing expenses related to control and security, suggesting she was spending significant money to maintain order among slaves. The investigator suspected the breaking point had come when slaves discovered Victoria was planning drastic changes that could threaten their lives. Financial records showed a substantial expense described only as necessary solutions 2 weeks before her death, suggesting she was considering extreme measures to resolve growing problems with resistant workers. Hargrove theorized that Nathaniel and other slaves had discovered these plans and realized their own lives were in danger. Based on documented behavior patterns and the operation's nature, he suspected slaves had taken desperate action to protect their own lives, resulting in Victoria's death during the night of October 17th. The theory explained why Victoria had been found in an apparently serene position. If her death had resulted from coordinated action by slaves, they would have had time and motivation to arrange the body to appear natural. The absence of struggle signs could be explained if she had been quickly overpowered by multiple people working together. More importantly, Hargrove's theory explained Edward Langford's behavior after his wife's death. If Edward was aware of Victoria's activities and suspected or knew how she had died, his urgency to liquidate assets and leave the region made perfect sense. He wasn't just dealing with grief, but with fear of exposure and possibly revenge. Edward's participation in the operation, as suggested by financial records, also explained his complicity after Victoria's death. If he had been complicit in activities leading to her death, he would have had an interest in protecting responsible slaves while simultaneously protecting himself through dispersing evidence and witnesses. Hargrove suspected the rapid sale and dispersal of slaves after Victoria's death had been coordinated not just by Edward, but by other local network members who had an interest in eliminating witnesses. The efficiency with which workers were sent to distant locations suggested planning beyond one man acting alone's capabilities. The investigator's theory about the local protection network explained the systematic resistance he had encountered during his investigation. If respectable community figures had participated in Victoria's activities, they would have had a desperate interest in keeping secrets buried, especially if they suspected her death had resulted from violence. Nathaniel had been one of the first victims of the silencing campaign because he possessed detailed knowledge about Victoria's operations and possibly had been the leader of the final action resulting in her death. His accidental death on a neighboring farm had been arranged to eliminate the most dangerous witness before he could be interrogated by investigators. Hargrove's investigation had also revealed circumstantial evidence that similar operations, though smaller, existed on other properties in the region. Victoria Langford hadn't been an isolated aberration, but part of a pattern exploiting slavery's legal and social vulnerabilities to satisfy the darkest impulses of people with power and resources. The magnitude of Hargrove's discoveries, even based on theories and circumstantial evidence, created a dilemma threatening his own safety. He possessed enough information to suggest serious crimes involving dozens of influential people, but also knew trying to completely expose the truth would result in his own destruction. Even more complicated, Hargrove realized any violence that might have occurred against Victoria Langford had been committed by people who were themselves victims of systematic abuse for years. Exposing the truth about her death would potentially mean condemning men who had acted in legitimate self-defense against a mortal threat. Hargrove's final decision was influenced by Isaiah's death, which confirmed the protection network was willing to use violence to maintain secrets. With this evidence that his own life was in danger, he chose to preserve his discoveries for posterity, while publicly ending the investigation with limited and safe conclusions. Instead of exposing his most explosive theories, Hargrove created 2 copies of his complete discoveries and hid them in safe locations in Alexandria and Norfolk, with instructions for them to be revealed only if something happened to him. He then wrote a very limited official report for contractors, confirming suspicions of financial irregularities, but deliberately omitting the most dangerous evidence. Hargrove's public report declared that while there was evidence of questionable and possibly immoral financial behavior by Victoria Langford, there wasn't sufficient proof to determine if her death had been caused by poisoning, violence, or other unnatural causes. The case was officially closed as death by natural causes, a conclusion satisfying contractors and allowing the investigation to be filed without dangerous public exposure. Edward Langford left the region in April 1848, officially to start a new life in another state after his wife's traumatic loss. In reality, he was fleeing a situation that had become completely unsustainable and potentially deadly. He had converted all remaining assets into cash and portable securities and disappeared from the area permanently. Edward's final fate was discovered by Hargrove through contacts in other cities. He had tried to establish himself in Charleston, South Carolina, under a partially false name. But his new identity didn't protect him from the psychological consequences of his past crimes and constant fear of exposure. In November 1848, Edward was found dead in his room, apparently by suicide through laudanum poisoning. Edward's suicide letter, which Hargrove managed to obtain through contacts in local police, confirmed many details the investigator had deduced. Edward admitted complete knowledge of his wife's activities, his own participation in financial and logistical aspects of the operation, and his complicity in maintaining secrecy. He expressed deep remorse, but also relief, at finally escaping a situation that had become unbearable. Edward's death effectively ended the last direct and verifiable link to Langford family operations. With Victoria dead and Edward suicided, the only remaining witnesses were local network members who had been visitors or facilitators, and former slaves who had been systematically dispersed and silenced. Hargrove realized an imperfect form of justice had been served. Victoria Langford had died under circumstances he suspected were related to her own actions. Edward had destroyed himself through his own guilt and fear, and the local network had been effectively dismantled through the elimination of its central organizers and evidence dispersal. The Langford family legacy in the city was carefully rewritten by the local community. Victoria was remembered as a charitable lady who had died tragically young, while Edward was portrayed as a devastated widower who couldn't overcome his loss. The property was sold to a respectable family with no knowledge of its dark history. Hargrove kept his complete theories and evidence secret for the rest of his life, but left detailed instructions for the truth to be revealed after his death. He died of natural causes in 1876, more than 25 years after the regional events. His evidence was discovered by his heirs and eventually donated to historical archives, where it remained sealed for additional decades. The complete Langford family story, including Hargrove's theories about the circumstances of her death, only emerged in the early 20th century, when historians with archive access began investigating claims contained in his private reports. Even then, many details remained as unproven theories, and the complete truth about the network's extent was never fully established. The slaves who possibly participated in Victoria Langford's death disappeared into history, their fates unknown. Some may have managed to escape to the north after being sold. Others probably died under suspicious circumstances. Nathaniel, the possible leader of the final action, was silenced before he could confirm or deny Hargrove's theories. The Langford property was eventually demolished in the late 19th century to make way for commercial developments. No plaque or memorial marks the location where one of local history's most disturbing operations possibly functioned for years under the facade of social respectability. Hargrove's theories about Victoria Langford's death remained as informed speculation based on circumstantial evidence. Though his patterns and deductions were convincing, the absence of direct witnesses or conclusive physical evidence meant the exact truth about that fateful night's events would never be known with absolute certainty. What remained indisputable was evidence that Victoria Langford had directed a systematic abuse operation involving dozens of slaves over several years, generated substantial revenue through immoral activities, and created a complicity network, including respectable local community figures. Regardless of her death's exact circumstances, her life had represented one of the most disturbing forms of exploitation within an already morally indefensible system. The story of Victoria and Edward Langford confronts us with a terrifying reality about the secrets that can hide behind society's most respectable facades. In an era when absolute power over other human beings was not only legal, but socially accepted, the limits of human depravity were tested in ways that challenge our most basic understanding of morality and decency. What makes this story particularly haunting is the systematic way Victoria had organized her activities. We're not talking about occasional impulses or isolated transgressions, but a behavior pattern that abused dozens of different people over several years, generated substantial revenue for the time, and involved respectable local community figures as participants and protectors. The complicity network protecting Victoria's operations revealed how power and influence can be used not only to commit crimes but to systematically cover them up. Merchants, farmers, and possibly local officials became accomplices in activities violating not only the era's laws, but humanity's most fundamental principles. Perhaps this story's most disturbing aspect is the uncertainty remaining about how justice was finally served. Hargrove's theories suggest slaves who possibly killed Victoria Langford acted in legitimate self-defense against a mortal threat. But the absence of conclusive evidence means we'll never know for certain if this desperate justice actually occurred. Edward Langford's death by suicide represents the final weight of guilt and fear accompanying participation in systematic atrocities. Even those who benefit from abuse systems eventually discover the psychological price of their complicity can become literally unbearable. This story also reminds us how many dark secrets of history remain buried, protected by power and influence networks transcending generations. Hargrove's decision to keep his most explosive discovery secret during his lifetime illustrates how truth can be suppressed, not only by those who commit crimes, but by those who discover evidence of crimes too dangerous to expose. The region wasn't unique in harboring such secrets. In a society built on the premise that some humans could completely own others, opportunities for abuse were limited only by the imagination and impulses of those in power. The Langford family story represents just one documented example of horrors probably repeated in countless other properties and communities. The numbers are impressive and terrifying. Dozens of direct victims, multiple babies born and sold, regular visitors, and a protection network including respectable community figures. It was an abuse system operating on a considerable scale under the protection of social respectability and forced silence. Today, when we look back at this period of American history, it's easy to distance ourselves from committed crimes, treating them as aberrations from a more barbarous era. But Victoria Langford's story reminds us that social respectability and public morality frequently mask much darker realities. This story's true lesson may be the importance of questioning official narratives and critically examining those who hold power over others. Respectability can be performed, morality can be feigned, and community pillars can hide the darkest secrets. The slaves who possibly rose against Victoria Langford remind us that even in the most desperate circumstances, human resistance can find a way to manifest. If Hargrove's theories were correct, their action was simultaneously an act of desperation and courage, a final refusal to accept the unacceptable, even knowing it could cost their own lives. The Langford family story remains as a dark testament to horrors that can flourish when absolute power meets human depravity, and how justice, when denied through official channels, can eventually find its own tortuous paths to resolution. In an era where we continue discovering buried secrets from the past and confronting abuse systems persisting in the present, this regional story serves as a disturbing reminder that constant vigilance and courage to confront uncomfortable truths remain essential to prevent such atrocities from repeating. The property where Victoria Langford exercised her dark power may have been demolished, but her story's lessons echo through centuries. They remind us that a society's true measure isn't in its public institutions or moral declarations, but in how it treats those who have no power to defend themselves. And perhaps the most important lesson is that the darkest secrets frequently hide behind the most respectable facades, protected by complicity networks extending far beyond what we ever imagined possible. Victoria Langford's story reminds us that truth, however disturbing, eventually finds a way to emerge, even if it remains incomplete and surrounded by mystery. Hargrove's theories about what really happened on that isolated property may never be completely proven, but they force us to confront the reality that justice doesn't always come through official channels. And sometimes the only people willing to act against evil are those who have suffered most under its weight. If this tale of hidden horrors in America's past has you rethinking history, hit that like button and subscribe for more gripping true stories that peel back the layers of the unknown. Drop a comment below. Do you believe justice was served in the end? Thanks for joining me. Stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.